Welcome back. Well, we're now racing towards the end of the month. This is our penultimate episode of Nigel Neal at Hammer. We have one more Tuesday left next week in which we'll cover The Abominable Snowmen. But we're going to be talking today about 1966's The Witches, starring Hollywood icon Joan Fontaine. So, as always, we'll jump into it and then get to the review. For this one, I'm still going to avoid a couple of spoilers towards the end of the film, but generally speaking, things, including the title, give you a bit of a heads up where things are heading, so we can spoil a bit more than usual, but I'll still be conscious of not spoiling too much towards the end. We meet Gwen, who's doing some work and some research in Africa. It's almost as if we've picked up at the end of a separate film, as she's been run out of town somewhere in Africa by local witch doctors. Rather disturbing imagery and quite a way to kick off a Hammer film. It hasn't dated terribly well, it must be said, but again, we're viewing this with 1966 eyes. And in other ways, the film's terribly progressive, so we can come to that in the review. She, between shots, so between the end of her African adventure where she's run out of town and the next scene, she's had a nervous breakdown and quite a bit of time has elapsed. She's now back in England and goes for a job interview with Alan Bax, the Reverend Alan Bax, played by Alec McCown. And he asks her about her experience and her breakdown, but is satisfied that she's suitable for the position of headmistress of the local school for which he's interviewing her. So she takes the position, comes to the lovely little idyllic village, and it is very pleasant indeed. Looks terribly boring to me. I'm a city boy. I need that corruption running through my lungs. But for those people that like village fetes and the like and jumble sales. I'm sure it's all perfectly lovely. But yeah, it's idyllic stuff. When you picture quintessential English village, this is the kind of place that she's in. So it's lovely. It's good for her mental health after what she's been through. Uh, Perfect for her. The children, nice as ninepence. Everybody she meets along the way seems to fall in love with her instantly. Her house girl, for example, played by Michelle Doutrice, great to see her in an early role. She's got a small role in one of my favourite films of all time, Blood and Satan's Claw, which I do have a review of on the channel. But would go on to sitcom fame with Some Mothers Do Have Him as Bitty. She, that being Gwen, settles in very well. She meets the school children, everything's wonderful. She meets the butcher, she meets everybody of import in the village, including Alan, the Reverend who recruits her, including his sister, played by Kay Walsh, who was married to David Lean and had some wonderful parts in his movies in the 40s. They divorced, so she didn't get many parts from him after that, but hey. She's Stephanie. She's a journalist, and quickly we learn she's a very forthright woman, very independent, modern woman, and she respects Gwen for saying that she disagrees with a lot of what she's written and what she's read because she's a famous journalist, and she respects her for standing up for what she believes. So they form a very fast friendship. Um, we then learn very early on in the film, which is very Nigel Neal, that something's not right. So, as always, he likes to drip tension along the way. Our vicar, who recruited Joan Fontaine as Gwen to work in the village, he's not a vicar at all. He just dresses up as one because he wasn't good enough, wasn't holy enough. Wonder where that'll lead. But he does it just to make himself feel better and for a little bit of authority in the village. Joan Fontaine doesn't ask too many questions about that. She just kind of leaves him hanging and is like, okay, I'm going home. See you later. She goes to the school, children, fantastic. She singles out a couple of them, the older children of the class. Being a small village, they're kind of mixed ages, who are Ronnie and Linda. Ronnie and Linda are having a very pure, innocent teenage relationship where they're just flowering into their pubescent years and are clearly smitten with each other, but in a very cute way. They're just arm in arm walking down the lanes and whatnot, exchanging little presents. There's nothing dirty going on or anything. So why are the village seemingly up in arms about this? Why are all the local shopkeepers talking about Ronnie as if he's the total reprobate? Why are all these middle-aged women so concerned with splitting up a couple of 13-year-olds? Quite odd. So again, this adds to the sense of unease for us because we know what kind of picture we're in. But it also adds to Joan Fontaine wondering what do you care? Anyway, so she the next day at class realizes one of her pupils is missing, and wouldn't you know, it's young Linda. She goes to look after Linda at the house that she stays in with her granny. And Ronnie has tipped her off that old Granny has mangled Linda's fingers for daring to see him. When she goes there, the young girl Linda says, "No, no, I did it to myself. It was just an accident. I was clumsy. I'm always clumsy, and I never want to see Ronnie again. He's just horrible. He just annoys me. He's always following me about. I don't actually care for him." And the granny pipes in. The granny is clearly our witch character here, Granny Rig, played by Gwen Franken Davis, who will appear in one of my absolute favourite Hammer films, which we're going to cover on Halloween itself. So the granny is very much anti-Ronnie, more than just about anybody we've met in the village at all. The next day, wouldn't you know, there's another empty seat in class. Ronnie hasn't showed up. He's been taken extremely ill to the point he has to be taken to hospital, and it's the last we see of Ronnie on screen. And his health, we're told, is stable, but we never see him again, and we're never told if he recovers. So, something could be rather dark at the end of this for Ronnie off screen. So there's an implication that, wait a minute, just by coincidence, the two children involved in this have both come to harm within 48 hours of John Fontaine picking up on the relationship that they have and the fact that the village seem to hate it. What's going on here? So she starts to investigate. Ronnie's father comes to see her, and he meets a rather bizarre end. He is drunkenly falls into the little lake they have and drowns. But John Fontaine says, no, he was going to Granny's house. Granny denies that he ever turned up, and the village just cover it up completely as being, nah, he was drunk that night. He just fell in and drowned. Perfectly innocent. So this is where Joan Fontaine really starts to think, no, there's something major going on here. She confides in Stephanie, the Kay Walsh character, and Stephanie says, no, we need to look into this. There's definitely something going on here, and it might even be a coven because there's more than a few people needed to cover things like this up. So they are about to set off and do so when this will sound ridiculous, but believe me, it plays really well. Joan Fontaine is attacked by a herd of rampaging sheep. She's knocked down by them, and she, that night upon recovery, has a really bad moment where she wakes from her slumber to see a totem, just like the one that chased her in Africa, and it causes another nervous breakdown halfway through the film. So she's had a complete mental breakdown, and we skip forward months again. Such an odd structure to this film. So skip forward months again, and she's completely amnesiac when it comes to what's happened in the village. She remembers Africa, but nothing after. She has been put in a home, and nobody's come to visit her. She's been looked after by a doctor played by Leonard Rossiter, which for sitcom fans is rather bizarre to see Reggie Perrin, Rising Damp, as a doctor, a very professional looking doctor. But there's a sense that she's been put away, you know. So she has to escape for the sake of her ultimate sanity. Her memories start to come flooding back when she sees a little doll because earlier in the film she found a doll which seemed to be a voodoo doll with pins in it, almost exactly the same time that Ronnie had been taken unwell. So again, all this evidence that's coming back to her in bits and pieces stacks up, and she starts to put two and two together, and she's now convinced that she has four. She's sick of people saying, no, don't worry, it's five. Don't worry about it. Come on, go with the mob mentality. The greater good. She goes back to the village, and I don't think I want to go too much further than that because now she's on to the coven, she's on to the conspiracy. She knows old Granny's up to something, and only her and Stephanie, so only Gwen and Stephanie, believe that there's a conspiracy, that there's witchcraft afoot. Can they solve it? Can they save more young people? Can they root out the witches? Can they end the witchcraft in the village? Now, again, in this month, we're looking at underseen Hammer films. I think this still qualifies, and a number of people are watching this series for recommendations as much as they are, validation of what they've already seen. So I don't think I should spoil what happens in the last 20 minutes of the film because it's very unusual. Very unusual. Let's get to the review, though. Wonderful. See you tomorrow. Nigel Neal is on full form here. The kind of things that he loves to explore, the group mentality, the herd mentality of people, that if enough people get together, they are potentially an evil force. The belief in the ancient and the uncanny, rather than looking forward to enlightenment being a problem. So we always, just like Joan Fontaine here is almost Quatermass, and she's coming up against the more pagan-like characters who we would meet in the likes of the fourth Quatermass serial, just Quatermass. Nigel Neal, sorry, brings that tension, that atmosphere, and again, like I've been saying, the breadcrumbs that add to it throughout. So very early on, he throws in, which another script writer would do something much later, where, the vicar's not a real vicar. Nigel Neal puts that in nearly at the start to just let you, every 5 minutes, have something uncanny and bizarre to drip, 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 and make you feel just a bit more queasy every so often, rather than have it settle, 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 ramp up. He drips it. It's very, very well structured in a typical Nigel Neal fashion. Joan Fontaine's character, Gwen, is quite a Quatermass-like. She's a rational skeptic. She is open to investigation, and again, she doesn't run up against red tape like Quatermass, but she runs up in the equivalent of it, the village equivalent of it, through villagers. And how can you, if you don't have hard evidence, how can you prove witchcraft of all things? So the authorities never get involved here because she knows I've been mentally ill multiple times. Who's going to believe this kind of thing? Joan Fontaine's performance is fine. I don't think it's great. I don't think she was ever a great actress. She was a great star. There's a difference. But even in Rebecca or Suspicion, I don't think she was ever terrific. She's not even the best actress in her family. Her sister, Olivia de Havilland, was. The performance of Kay Walsh as Stephanie is one I can't go into too much because of what happens in the last 20 minutes, where she comes much more to the fore. But it's a sublime performance. She takes charge. She's a raging bull in this film, rampaging like those sheep. She's phenomenal, gives it a real energy. And like I mentioned at the start, the idea of the African thing may seem that's a bit dated even for the 66. But our two leads here are female, and they're both strong, independent women who don't rely on men. Indeed, the only man that's kind of in the main cast here is the Reverend, and he's very much a nothing compared to his sister, who clearly is the brains of the operation. So very ahead of the curve for Hammer to have two female leads here, who have great chemistry together. They have wonderful scenes, and Nigel Neal writes them to perfection. One of the stars here who would be not a name that you would recognize perhaps is Martin Stevens. But trust me, you know him if you're a horror fan because he was the main boy in Village of the Damned, the main kid. And further to that, he was the main star, if you like, in the child sense, in The Innocents, the great Jack Clayton film from what, 61 was The Innocents. So I mean, he was a real child prodigy because he's wonderful in those films. His scenes with Deborah Kerr in The Innocents are remarkable. Unfortunately, here he doesn't get as much to do as he did when he was an 11-year-old, 12-year-old. But it's great to see him regardless. It would be his last film. He would leave acting. Joan Fontaine would not make another movie after this. She lived for another few decades, but didn't make another movie. And unfortunately, Hollywood being Hollywood, you're too old. So she was relegated to TV movies and The Love Boat and things like that, and Fantasy Island. Total waste of her gifts, such as they were, but total waste of her stardom anyway. Oh well. The structure of the film, as I mentioned, remarkable, but so is the direction. The direction of the film is tonally on point, and it's not from one of Hammer's great directors. It's not a guest director, so it's not a Terence Fisher, it's not a Jimmy Sangster even, and it's not a Joseph Losey like a guest director. It's Cyril Frankel, who had directed for Hammer before with Never Take Sweets from a Stranger, but was quite a journeyman, did a lot of television. So not a great name, but he does a brilliant job. It's a stunning looking picture. The cinematography is by Arthur Grant, who did yesterday's The Damned. So again, he's a real stunning photographer of film. Just knows how to shoot a picture. Looks absolutely breathtaking. It's a gorgeous film. The greens just pop out of the screen. He's got a real wonderful use of color. The music is by Richard Rodney Bennett, who would go on to multiple Oscar nominations, and it's wonderful. It's eerie and atmospheric. It uses some African rhythms, again, quite ahead of the curve, to indicate that we're at an uncanny scene. There's a great scene with a doll that's oversized and has a something very unusual inside it, which again could be quite ridiculous, but the music sets it up as being something spooky. And believe me, when it happens, it is one of those like oof moments, just like the sheep. I mentioned a herd of rampaging sheep. How ridiculous does that sound? Well, actually, it's quite terrifying when it happens. It's quite terrifying. It's remarkable the way that Nigel Neal was able to write these things that on paper could be ridiculous, but they work perfectly in terms of his sensibilities. He just knows his subject matter. He knows how to write country folk. He was a Manxman himself from the Isle of Man, so he knew how to write people that weren't received pronunciation Londoners and whatnot. Wonderful, wonderful stuff. I don't think I need to talk much more about this one because I'm just gushing about absolutely every aspect. I think this is one of the real underrated hammers. Um, Not that many people hate it, but most people think of it kind of middle of the road, and to me, it's very near the top of the pile for me. It's it's almost folk horror. It's almost folk horror, and again, that's pure Nigel Neal. It sets up something that he would do in the 70s, a TV film called Moraine, which, yeah, if you haven't seen that, check that out too. But this film, absolutely fantastic. So, generic title, um, doesn't always get the best write-ups, especially towards the end of the film, which again, I'm not going to talk about, but I think there's no problem with the end of the film. It makes sense to me. Every scene tonally works for where the scene needs to be. So yeah, it's difficult to talk about it and having to talk around it without spoiling anything, but no, it works perfectly for me, absolutely from start to finish. Potentially the very end of the film is a little bit trite, but again, I don't want to go into spoiler territory. Don't want to touch it, but let me know what you think in the comments below as always. Well then, my darlings, tomorrow we're going to be looking at the Pirates of Blood River and oh, how we're going forward the rest of the week. Pirates of Blood River, and then Curse of the Werewolf's going to be on Thursday, and then on Friday, Plague of the Zombies, because I need to do either one of Plague of the Zombies or the Reptile, so I had to do Plague of the Zombies. And then at the weekend, it's Vampire Weekend, of course, for our final run of that. So, plenty to keep us all busy, I'm sure. But until tomorrow, when I'll see you with the pirates, don't have nightmares.